These are 4 of the scariest alien stories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. We will hear the stories, and then we will take a look at the backstories, the details, and the evidence of each story, trying to answer the question, are these stories real? Starting with the Joe Rogan Experience number 2018 featuring Post Malone. Now in this episode, Joe Rogan talks to Post Malone about the story of the Russian soldiers who were turned to stone after shooting at a UFO. Take a listen.
There's literally like a CIA document about it. That these guys supposedly shot at a low-flying spaceship. Look at it. According to the KGB materials, a quite low-flying spaceship in the shape of a saucer appeared above a military unit that was conducting routine training maneuvers. For unknown reasons, somebody unexpectedly launched a surface-to-air missile and hit the UFO. It fell to Earth not far away, and 5 short humanoids with large heads and large black eyes emerged from it. It is stated in the testimonies by the 2 soldiers who remained alive that after freeing themselves from the debris, the aliens came close together and then merged into a single object that acquired a spherical shape. That object began to buzz and hiss sharply and then became brilliant white. In a few seconds, the spheres grew much bigger and exploded by flaring up with an extremely bright light. At that very instant, 23 soldiers who had watched the phenomenon turned into stone poles. Yeah, only 2 soldiers who stood in the shade and were less exposed to the luminous explosion survived.
No shit.
The KGB report goes on to say that the remains of the UFO and the petrified soldiers were transferred to a secret scientific research institution near Moscow. Specialists assume that a source of energy that is still unknown to Earthlings instantly changed the structure of the soldiers' living organisms, having transformed it into a substance whose molecular composition is no different from that of limestone. Oh my God.
It turned them into limestone.
Turned them literally into limestone.
And this is a CIA paperwork?
Well, this is, they're reading from a KGB file, right? So it's just, go to the very bottom of that again, Jamie, the very bottom of that. It says, one of the things that says, the CIA representative stated, if the KGB file corresponds to reality, this is an extremely menacing case. The aliens possess such weapons and technology that go beyond all our assumptions. They can stand up for themselves if attacked. But the thing is, they're saying if the file corresponds to reality, that means there's a question.
If this is real, they're tough.
Yeah, they can fuck with you.
So back in the early 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, a ton of old KGB and Soviet military intel started leaking. And the US, of course, was scooping up everything that they could get their hands on. One of the documents that they ended up getting was a translated Soviet KGB report, and it was all about this alleged UFO encounter. And the CIA filed it under their paranormal activities category, and yes, this is an actual real thing that the CIA has. The file was titled something along the lines of Translation of a KGB Report on an Alien Encounter. The document itself was supposedly picked up from a Ukrainian newspaper, which was reporting on a leak from within the Russian intelligence community. Now, a few years later, this KGB report got declassified under the Freedom of Information Act, and then boom, this file that talks about Russian soldiers turning to stone was just sitting on the CIA's website. Now, what's crazy about this report is how dry and official the language is. Like, we heard Joe Rogan reading it. It says things like 23 soldiers were turned into a limestone-like substance following an encounter with an unidentified being. Like, what? So according to this report, this whole encounter starts with a Russian military unit that was somewhere out in the middle of nowhere. Now, the exact location isn't mentioned, but it's speculated that this happened deep in Siberia. So the soldiers are out in Siberia, they're training and patrolling and, doing God knows what, and then suddenly they spot something flying in the sky. It was described as a low-flying silver saucer-shaped object. And you also have to remember that this is in the Cold War era, so the Russian soldiers started to freak out and they were trained to shoot down, anything suspicious. So seeing this silver saucer, they grabbed a missile launcher and fired a missile at the saucer. And apparently the missile hit the saucer, causing it to crash to the ground not far from the soldiers. The soldiers slowly moved towards the saucer, and as they got closer, apparently 5 humanoid figures emerged from the downed craft. The report says that these beings were small, they had large heads, and most notably, they had glowing eyes. The soldiers at this point, had their weapons drawn and were, yelling commands at these beings, obviously, pretty fucking confused about what was going on. And then, without warning, the 5 beings suddenly grouped together and began merging into a single form. Like, according to the file, they didn't just huddle up in a group together, they literally physically transformed. Their bodies blended into each other like some kind of energy or matter manipulation. And what they became was basically this big single glowing white sphere that was just, floating and pulsing with energy. Then suddenly the sphere exploded into a massive flash of light. It didn't make any noise, there was no fire, it was just a blinding burst of pure white energy that just completely lit up the forest around them. Then when the light faded, everything was dead silent. And then 2 soldiers who were reportedly hiding behind a truck or a rock that didn't get hit with the blast, they peeked up from their hiding spot and they saw their fellow Russian soldiers, just completely frozen in place. The report describes their bodies as being transformed into a limestone-like substance. 23 soldiers stood there frozen with, no signs of life. They didn't have any burns and there was, no blood anywhere. Just literally stone statues of men who a few seconds ago were alive and breathing. Now, the 2 soldiers who survived managed to get a signal out, and in no time, the KGB just rolled on up. And if you guys aren't aware, the KGB was basically the Soviet Union's secret police and intelligence agency. And according to the report, the KGB immediately took over the scene. The area was completely sealed off and nobody was allowed near the site. The wreckage of the UFO was collected and packed up for transport. And it wasn't just the UFO, but it was also the statues of the 23 Russian soldiers who were, just standing there frozen. That was packed up too. According to the file, the KGB delivered everything, the craft parts, the stone remains, and full reports to a top secret research facility. From there, Soviet scientists were allegedly assigned to study the remains, and based on what the document says, even, those scientists were stunned. One line in the report mentions these scientists were convinced that the technology used to, petrify the soldiers was beyond anything known on Earth. Now, I know what I just said, sounds like I just, made all of this shit up and it's just some, fairy tale or some, local legend. But no. All of what I just said came directly from the official Soviet report. And like I mentioned previously, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a flood of declassified and leaked information coming out of former Soviet territories. And one of those leaks was a report that surfaced in a Ukrainian newspaper, which claimed to have details from a former KGB insider. This article is what actually described the UFO crash, the soldiers being turned into stone, and then the KGB basically covering it all up. And then the CIA picked it up. Someone in the US intelligence community flagged down the article, translated it into English, and then filed it into the CIA's archives. And to be clear, the CIA didn't confirm or deny anything that was mentioned in this report. They collected the report and then they just, put it in their archives. But it's the fact that they kept the file. They collected it, translated it, and then kept it. So to me, it seems like they must have believed, what they read. Because you would think if it was something that was completely outlandish and crazy, why would they keep it in the CIA archives? It was obviously a document worth preserving. All right, well, now let's talk about some of the possible explanations and the theories around this. Now, one of the first ideas that people would throw around when this report became public was that it was some kind of, advanced energy weapon, something like a plasma burst or a high frequency radiation that could scramble matter at a molecular level. And now this honestly isn't that far-fetched. Scientists have been experimenting with high energy fields and sonic weapons for decades, but they haven't even, been close to something that can literally turn a person into a statue. Now, another theory is something called flash fossilization. Now, under very specific conditions like sudden exposure to intense heat and minerals, it is possible for organic matter to fossilize extremely quickly. Like in some cases, volcanic eruptions have preserved things in almost, state-like form. So maybe, assuming that this event actually happened, this alien tech would have altered the material composition of these soldiers' bodies in a way that we just simply don't understand yet. Maybe. Then our last theory is that this, event just simply, never happened. It could have been all misinterpreted or even just made up. I mean, it could have been like a weapons test gone wrong. Maybe the soldiers died in a chemical accident and then someone tried to cover it up by saying that they were fighting aliens. Maybe somebody in the Soviet military wanted to create a rumor so crazy that nobody would ever believe it, yet alone investigate it. Meaning if something went wrong and they tried to cover it up, saying that these Russian soldiers were fighting aliens could literally just be the perfect cover story. All right, but anyways, let's move on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 2160 featuring Billy Carson. In this episode, Joe and Billy talk about the Anunnaki, so take a listen.
They show up everywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Atrahasis. Of course, even in the Bible, they're known as the Anak, A-N-A-K. We were grasshoppers in their eyesight, it says in the biblical text. So no matter where you go in any culture, you're going to discover that these beings, in some way, shape, or form, engaged mankind, brought knowledge, teaching, building techniques, and just so much more wisdom and information, esoteric wisdom, alchemy, all these things came from these people.
So the craziest version of this story is that they genetically engineered us out of lower primates and put us here to mine gold.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And then established different types of civilizations and taught us how to build things, taught us all these different things. And enough time has passed that we've kind of forgotten. Mm-hmm. Enough time has passed. That's the wackiest version of it, right?
Right. That's the bare bones minimum.
Yeah, the wackiest version is that they made us, mm-hmm. which is, we've talked about this a couple of times, but how bizarre it is that human beings have this incredible fascination for gold. Mm-hmm. We're fascinated with gold. Yeah. This fascination with gold is really weird. Mm-hmm. Like, why back when it was basically useless? You couldn't make a knife out of it. You couldn't, it didn't make sense that this would be so valuable. Just because it's rare, you're barely alive. We're going, we're going back to full-on hunter and gatherer, our ancestors with spears and stone chipped. And then after that, gold emerges, mm-hmm. and it stays. Yeah. It stays forever. Yeah. Now, when you read Zecharia Sitchin's book, he talks about this in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. His description of it was that they needed to suspend gold particles in the atmosphere mm-hmm. because their atmosphere was being destroyed.
Right.
Then you move to like somewhere around the 2000s when climate scientists start proposing this idea mm-hmm. of suspending reflective particles in the atmosphere.
Right.
And then when you realize the unique properties of gold, how unusual it is in terms of like a building material, you can coat things. Mm-hmm. The reason why things are like coated in gold, silver plated, or gold plated rather, you can take a tiny piece of gold and cover an enormous area with it. It's a strange metal. Yeah. Like really weird. Mm-hmm. And what, the supposed story is, it's very common on Earth, very rare on Nibiru.
Right.
To understand the Anunnaki, we have to go back around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago to ancient Mesopotamia, which is now modern-day Iraq. Here lived the Sumerians, one of the earliest known civilizations in human history. And the Sumerians were very advanced. They had cities, they had trade systems, they had legal codes, they had schools and irrigation, and they even had libraries. But what is so fascinating about the Sumerians was their mythology. And at the center of that mythology were these mysterious beings called the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki comes from An, which means heaven, and Ki, which means earth. So the word Anunnaki roughly translates to those who come from heaven to earth. Now that is quite literally how the Anunnaki are described. They're described as powerful, otherworldly entities who descended from the sky and played a major role in shaping the world. According to Sumerian mythology, the Anunnaki were gods, but like actual beings, if that makes sense. I mean, they had names, they had personality, there was ranks, and they even had family hierarchies. Now, what's very interesting about the Sumerians is that they wrote literally everything down. I mean, thousands of years ago, they were carving detailed stories onto clay tablets. These tablets contained origin stories, divine wars, family drama, instructions for rituals, and then, of course, the description of the Anunnaki themselves. Some texts describe the Anunnaki as descending from the sky in fire and thunder. Others mention heavenly boats or shining chariots. Now, some of the descriptions are oddly specific, like, technology or flying machines, and this has led a lot of modern researchers to wonder, were the Anunnaki gods, or were they, something else? Could they have been extraterrestrial beings, just misinterpreted as gods by early humans? The Sumerians credited the Anunnaki for being responsible for everything. I mean, from creating human beings to teaching early humans how to build, farm, and govern, to eventually, stepping back and letting humanity take over. In some myths, the Anunnaki ruled Earth for thousands of years before retreating to the heavens. Now, this is where things get pretty interesting. According to a lot of ancient Sumerian texts, like, those actually preserved on clay tablet texts, humans weren't just born or evolved naturally. The Sumerians claim that humans were created, and not just created for fun, but specifically to work. But let me just back up super quick, because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. In Sumerian mythology, there's this idea that the Anunnaki were already on Earth long before humans ever showed up. The story goes that the Anunnaki were tasked with managing and cultivating the Earth, like setting up agriculture, mining, building, organizing everything. But the catch is that the Anunnaki didn't want to do the labor themselves. So after a while, the Anunnaki, as powerful as they were, basically just got tired of working, so their solution was to create a new being that would do the work for them. And those beings being us. Humans. One of the most important texts here is called Atrahasis Epic. Now, this story described how the gods created the first humans by mixing divine essence with the clay of the earth. The text is clear that humans were created to carry the loads of the gods. Farming, building, serving, all the fun stuff. Zecharia Sitchin, who is an author of a number of books proposing an explanation for human origins, was one of the first people to popularize the idea that the Anunnaki weren't just mythological gods, but actual beings, like aliens. According to his interpretation of the ancient Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki come from a distant planet called Nibiru, and they were here on Earth for one specific reason, that being gold. Zecharia Sitchin claimed that the Anunnaki needed gold for technological purposes, mainly to repair their planet's atmosphere. He suggested that the gold particles could be used to reflect sunlight or stabilize planetary conditions. But mining gold on Earth would be hard work. So the story goes, the Anunnaki genetically engineered early humans by mixing their DNA with that of primitive hominids, essentially fast-tracking evolution to create a brand new species that could follow instructions and could handle physical labor. Now, I mean, of course, mainstream science and history are not fans of this theory, but even removing the whole Anunnaki are aliens theory, the original Sumerian stories still describe a very clear process where powerful sky beings create humans. They give them intelligence and purpose and then put them to work. And another interesting detail I think I should point out is that in some of these stories, the humans eventually became too numerous or too noisy, and the gods regretted creating them. And just like it says in the Bible, the gods decided to wipe out humanity and start over. All right, now I quickly want to touch on the planet Nibiru, which, like I said a few minutes ago, Zecharia Sitchin believes that that is where the Anunnaki came from. Now, right off the bat, I mean, this planet does not exist in any, mainstream astronomical record. NASA doesn't recognize it, and you won't find it in any solar system chart. But Sitchin claims that the planet is real and that it has an extremely long elliptical orbit that only brings it near Earth once every 3,600 years. So for example, instead of, orbiting the sun like Earth and Mars in a, neat little circle, Nibiru is supposedly on this just massive stretched out loop through the solar system. It disappears deep into space and then swings back around after thousands of years. Sitchin claims that the Sumerians knew about this planet and that ancient Sumerian tablets that depicted our solar system included Nibiru. And keep in mind that these tablets were written way long before telescopes or modern astronomy. The Sumerians, shouldn't have known how many planets we had, but according to Sitchin, they did. Sitchin thinks that the Anunnaki used advanced technology to travel between Nibiru and Earth, and their visit thousands of years ago is what gave rise to the Sumerian civilization in the first place. They mined gold here, they created humans, they set up shop, and then they eventually just left, promising to return on their planet's next cycle. Some people have even claimed that Nibiru has already entered our solar system and that, governments are just trying to cover it up. But yeah, I know the Anunnaki is a topic that can, kind of be hard to follow and to understand, but I guess just to try to make it as simple as possible, Anunnaki are basically aliens that created human life to help them mine gold. That's in a very short, simple way. Next, on the Joe Rogan Experience number 1645, featuring former Intelligence Secretary Christopher Mellon. Christopher Mellon gives his thoughts about Bob Lazar and Bob Lazar's stories and his claims. Take a listen.
I found his explanations curious.
Yeah. How so?
The complexity of it, and the fact that he talked about Laurentium, for example, and then decades later, it turns out that apparently there is a more stable form of that than...
That's element 115?
Sounds right. I couldn't tell you for sure.
It's called Laurentium?
Laurentium.
That sounds like something from Battlestar Galactica. We need the Laurentium
all this stuff
to power
takes
the
you
ship.
into that,
yeah.
right?
Right.
So now I'm a little skeptical about his claims, I have to say. A friend of mine claims to know the gal who was his supervisor when he worked out there and knows what he was actually doing and where he was located, and claims that he was a guy who checked radiation on badges.
That's it.
Yeah.
And so all the rest is fiction.
According to that story.
And this is a person that you know?
Yeah.
Maybe that person's full of shit.
Maybe.
How about that?
I don't have the ground truth on this,
yeah.
but
it's interesting.
He did falsify his educational records, and he's been involved in some other things, and it just doesn't.
You talking about the MIT records?
Yeah.
Yeah. He explained that to me. He said that he was working on something for the government and they sent him to MIT to learn something, and I can't say too much. I'll tell you off air because he told me not to talk about it, but it makes more sense when you hear his description of it, that essentially it wasn't documented that he was studying there, because what he was doing was really a terrible thing, a terrible experiment they were working on. When I explain it to you, maybe it'll make more sense.
Okay.
Maybe not, though. Maybe he's full of shit. Maybe he lied about that. What's interesting, though, is he's told the same exact story since the late 80s. And he doesn't seem full of shit. Now, some people are really good at lying. And, I've been tricked before, and I'm sure you have, too. There's some people that are just sociopaths. They're really good at...
Yeah, they don't even, know they're lying. They're, convinced in their own head while they're spinning it.
He's obviously very intelligent, and he obviously knows a lot about science. He knows a lot about propulsion systems, and he really did work at Los Alamos, which is interesting because he's actually on the employee roster.
Yep.
And they tried to say that he didn't. He knew people that were there. He knew the layout of the building. When he went there with George Knapp, they went through the building. He knew exactly where everything was, and he knew the people that worked there. So he really did work there, apparently, allegedly. His story... What's interesting to me is that, again, it's the same story over and over and over again. And then what's also interesting to me is that he knew and took friends to a place where they were testing these things out. and he knew where it was, and he knew when they were doing it, and he brought his friends out there, and that's when they got arrested.
Bob Lazar is a physicist and engineer who claims to have worked on reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology at a super secret base near Area 51. Bob was born in 1959, and while we don't really know that much about his early personal life, he popped into the public eye in the late 1980s with some really wild stories. But before that, Bob had a reputation, at least locally, as the guy who strapped a jet engine to his Honda and drove it around Los Alamos, New Mexico. He was obsessed with propulsion, high energy physics, and building crazy inventions. Lazar claims to have studied physics at the California Institute of Technology and also earned a master's in electronics from MIT. But as we heard in the Joe Rogan clip, there are no official records of him attending either school. There are no transcripts, there's no diplomas, there's no classmate testimonies, there's nothing. Now, Bob Lazar says that's because the government erased all evidence of his education as a part of a cover-up to discredit him after he went public. According to him, when he started talking about what he saw at S4, the super secret base outside of Area 51, the government wiped everything about him. Now, when people hear this fact that, Bob Lazar doesn't have any evidence that he went to these schools, they think, there's no way that someone can erase their presence of being at places like MIT and Caltech. But Bob's name does show up in the Los Alamos phone directory from the early 80s, listing him as a physicist working at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and that's a serious government lab where nuclear research happens. He also appeared in a 1982 newspaper article that called him physicist at Los Alamos and mentioned the jet power Honda. Now that lends some sort of credibility to his background, because if he wasn't who he said he was, why would the lab list him, and then why would the paper write about him in that way? Now, at the time of Bob's rise to fame, he was working in Nevada and doing technical work and science work. So when he later claimed to have been recruited to work at a site called S4 near Area 51, it wasn't really that far-fetched. Bob says he was hired through a contractor called EG&G, and that he went through a bizarre and rigorous clearance process before being allowed anywhere near the facility. Now, to me personally, what makes Bob Lazar so fascinating is that he's not like flashy, and he doesn't seem, like the type to try to jump into the spotlight for attention. I mean, in fact, he spent most of like the last 30 plus years avoiding the spotlight. He's always maintained the same story in the same calm and logical tone. So by the time he went public in 1989, speaking anonymously at first with journalist George Knapp from Las Vegas's KLAS TV, Lazar had this strange mixture of, mystery and, just tons of technical knowledge. I mean, people didn't really know what to make of him. Many people thought he was a whistleblower risking his life, and others thought he was a con man. But one thing was for sure, he completely changed the UFO conversation forever. After Bob Lazar, Area 51 became the default setting for alien conspiracies. Before Bob, nobody even knew that S4 existed, and no one really talked about Area 51 or what they were doing in there. And like I mentioned previously, in 1989, Bob Lazar sat down with journalist George Knapp in Las Vegas, and that's when he gave one of the most shocking interviews ever broadcasted on mainstream news. He first appeared anonymously using the fake name Dennis, and he said he had worked at a top secret facility called S4, located just south of Area 51 along the dry lake bed of Papoose Lake. He claimed that S4 was hidden in plain sight, built right into the side of a mountain, camouflaged to blend in with the surrounding terrain. Inside this facility, Lazar says the US government was housing and working on actual alien spacecrafts. Actually, 9 of them to be exact. They were all different sizes and shapes, some looking like a classic flying disc, while others were a bit more unconventional. The craft he was specifically assigned to work on was nicknamed the Sport Model. According to him, it was a small, sleek craft, roughly, 52 feet in diameter, and it was just shaped like a classic saucer. He said that the craft didn't look like anything made by human hands. The materials, the shape, the way it moved, it wasn't from Earth. Earth. And Bob Lazar's job was to reverse engineer the propulsion system and try to understand how it worked and whether humans could replicate the technology. He said the craft used a reactor powered by something called element 115, which is a super heavy element that at the time, hadn't been discovered by mainstream science. According to Bob, this reactor produced its own gravitational field, which could be amplified and focused using 3 gravity wave amplifiers located underneath the saucer. These amplifiers would bend space-time around the craft, allowing it to essentially fall forward in the direction it wanted to go. The craft had no wings, no exhaust, no traditional thrust. It was all about manipulating gravity. And this is what really grabbed the attention of scientists, engineers, and UFO researchers. Bob Lazar wasn't just like, hey, this craft is just, it's just flying. He was describing detailed theoretical physics about how it could be possible. Things like gravity propulsion, space-time distortion, and inertia cancellation. He even drew diagrams and broke down how the craft could shift orientation during flight. He claimed it would tilt on its side, point one of the gravity emitters in the direction it wanted to go, and then it would just fall into that distorted space. That's how it achieved those high speeds, those right angle turns people report, seeing in UFO sightings. And it was because the saucer wasn't flying through the air, it was bending the space around it. Lazar said the entire project was handled with extreme secrecy. He wasn't allowed to freely walk around S4. His access was tightly limited to his specific assignment. He said he'd be flown into Area 51 on a Janet flight and then bussed to S4. His security clearance was high level, but compartmentalized. He was paired with another scientist named Barry, and just a little side note, Barry's last name is never mentioned, but together they were tasked with analyzing the ship's propulsion system. Lazar claimed the internal layout of the craft didn't even seem designed for humans. He claims that the ceilings were low, the control panel was bizarre, and there were no screens and no buttons. Everything just seemed so smooth and seamless, like it was basically just molded from one piece. It didn't look bolted together, it looked, manufactured in a way that, us humans just simply don't understand. And even stranger, he said that the ship actually worked. I mean, he witnessed one of the crafts hovering silently in a test demonstration out at S4. He described the ship rising off the ground with no sound, no heat, and no visible means of propulsion, just floating, effortlessly and controlled. Now, the biggest question of all is, did any of this shit really happen? I mean, there are no photos, there's no official documents, and obviously the government denies everything. But Lazar didn't just say it once and disappear. I mean, he has stuck to his story for over 30 years, and it's like word for word. And even under pressure, under scrutiny, and during these interviews that happened decades apart, his story has remained incredibly consistent. It's the consistency that keeps people coming back to Bob Lazar's story. Because while some of what, Lazar says sounds crazy, I mean, he just doesn't change his tune. He doesn't get caught exaggerating or changing details to match, new discoveries. And I mean, he even told this story before element 115 was ever added to the periodic table. He talked about this before Area 51 was officially acknowledged by the government. I mean, he was saying this stuff when no one else was talking about it. But anyways, enough about Bob Lazar. Let's move on to the Joe Rogan Experience number 2331 featuring Jesse Michaels. In this episode, Joe and Jesse discuss alien bases on the moon, and specifically how Carl Wolf claimed he saw images of these bases.
Well, but AJ from the Y-Files was on, and he was the one that was telling us that there's photos, right, of the dark side of the moon, that someone had seen photos and was assuming that these would be released shortly, that there were structures. Wow, this is going to be the biggest news ever, and then it was never released.
Are you talking about maybe Carl Wolf?
Is that what it was?
Who was taken to, this is all his claims, and he died in a freakish bike accident a little after saying this. But he said that there was in Langley, Virginia, where a lot of spooky stuff goes on. He was taken to it was inside a mountain complex, which we definitely, Carl Wolf, yeah.
That guy bikes?
Yeah, apparently not enough.
That guy could die any time.
Oh, man.
On a scooter. So, photographs of the 1966 lunar orbiter mission that revealed large base of the moon.
And in his case, he says that he was in this, mountain base or whatever where all of the world's nations were working together as part of some collegial UN style space program or whatever.
Carl Wolf was a trained U.S. Air Force technician, specifically a precision electronics photographic repairman with direct access to some of the most advanced surveillance and imaging technology of his time. Carl's official title was Airman Second Class, and during his service in the 1960s, he was stationed at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. His responsibilities were extremely specific and highly technical. He worked within the Tactical Air Force Command, and his primary role was to maintain and calibrate photographic equipment, which, is equipment used to process and interpret high-resolution images captured during aerial and orbital renaissance missions. That includes photos from spy planes, satellites, and even early lunar missions. Wolf's job was deeply sensitive, and it was precision-level work that required top-secret security clearance. Now, I personally think it's very important to note that Carl Wolf wasn't a scientist or a UFO researcher. He was a trained technician whose job depended on accuracy and attention to detail. He understood exactly what kind of photographic evidence he was looking at, and he wasn't easily fooled by, shadows or film glitches. So I just want you guys to keep that in the back of your mind. Now, during his time at Langley, Wolf was indirectly connected to NASA's Lunar Orbiter program, which began in the mid-1960s. The Lunar Orbiter missions were designed to map the moon's surface in preparation for the Apollo landings. The data collected would help determine safe landing zones for the astronauts, and some of the imagery collected during this period was among the highest resolution space photography at the time. Wolf's department worked on developing and analyzing images coming in from the Lunar Orbiter spacecraft, which were unmanned probes that circled the moon and photographed both the near side and far side of the lunar surface. Now, it's important to emphasize here the far side of the moon, or some people call it the dark side of the moon. Back then it was just a huge mystery. Because it never faces Earth due to, tidal locking, no one had ever seen it in full detail until spacecrafts like, the Lunar Orbiter began sending back images. At this point, Wolf had no reason to suspect anything unusual. He was just doing his job, helping to process those images that would be used by scientists and military analysts. But that would all change in an instance when he was called to troubleshoot a problem in another department, one with access to classified lunar imagery. Now, this wasn't unusual. Wolf was frequently called in to troubleshoot sensitive machines. But this particular request took him to a location that he hadn't been before. It was a lab that was operated by another division within the base, and this division was closely connected with NASA's lunar imaging operations. The lab was housed in a secure facility, and the moment that Wolf walked in, he could tell that it wasn't an ordinary workspace. The room was dark, and it was lit mostly by red safety lights, which, is standard for photo labs to prevent exposure damage to films. And the atmosphere in that room was just super tense. The technicians were working quietly, and they were focused on what appeared to be high-resolution photographs that were being developed from recent Lunar Orbiter missions. Now, Wolf's task was pretty straightforward. It was to repair a piece of equipment that was interrupting the flow of work. He was led to the machine in question and began doing his diagnostics. As he worked, another technician, a man Wolf described as clean-cut, around his own age and clearly comfortable in the lab, struck up, a pretty casual conversation. And what began as, small talk quickly turned into something far more serious. The technician lowered his voice and, in what Wolf later described as an almost, confessional tone, said something shocking. He said, "By the way, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon." And hearing this, Wolf was fucking stunned. He thought the man was joking, but, the technician was completely serious. He pointed to the photographic prints that they'd been working on and said that they'd been analyzing structures, like clear, artificial-looking features on the far side of the moon. These weren't natural formations. According to the technician, the photos showed buildings, towers, domes, and other geometric structures that clearly suggested intelligent design. Then, in a move that violated protocol but changed Wolf's life forever, the technician showed him the actual photographs. What Wolf saw shocked him to the core. He described the images as showing perfectly proportioned geometric shapes, rectangular structures, spherical domes, and what looked like tall, thin towers casting long shadows on the lunar surface. He said some of the buildings appeared metallic and highly reflective, Again, not consistent with any natural lunar geography. Now, one of the most striking features he claimed was the sheer scale of these structures. They weren't like little tiny installations. They looked like, large, possibly ancient or advanced facilities, almost like a city or, at least a complex of buildings. Now, Wolf didn't get to study the photos in details. He only got to glimpse at them for a moment. But what he saw was enough to completely shatter his understanding of the moon and of humanity's place in the universe. He later said in interviews, "I looked at one particular photo where there was a cluster of structures that appeared like radar dishes or towers. I realized they were not man-made and that they were not ours. They were on the moon, and they were alien." As soon as Wolf saw the images, he knew that he wasn't supposed to be looking at them. The encounter left him deeply shaken, like it would, any of us. He finished his repairs, he thanked the technician, and then he left the lab. But what he had just seen, I don't think you could ever unsee that. He knew those images weren't just anomalies or tricks of light. In his mind, they were proof. Solid proof of intelligent non-human activity on the moon. Now, after his experience in that dark, red-lit lab at Langley Air Force Base, Carl Wolf was left with a secret that he, hadn't asked for, but it was a secret that he knew could change everything if it got out. So he decided to stay completely silent. Not a word to his superiors, not, a hint to his peers, not even a whisper to close friends or family. Wolf took what he had seen and buried it deep inside, knowing full well the potential consequences if he ever spoke up. Now, you have to understand the context here. This wasn't modern day social media culture where people, expose secrets by uploading a video to Twitter or Instagram or whatever. This was the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War. Military personnel, especially those with access to classified intelligence, were bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, national security oaths, and a deeply ingrained chain of command. If Wolf had talked, if he had say, "Hey, I saw alien structures on the moon," he likely would have faced immediate court-martial, discharge, or psychological evaluation. In that era, people didn't get invited onto, talk shows and podcasts for whistleblowings, he wouldn't have been on an episode of Joe Rogan. I'll just say that. And instead of being on Joe Rogan, they went to psychiatric wards and just got completely discredited. So his silence wasn't just about fear. It was honestly about survival. And Wolf wasn't the only one. Many military insiders, intelligence officers, and contractors, who have claimed to see or hear similar things have echoed the same concern. The fear of retaliation was real and it was super powerful. Careers were destroyed over much less. I'll just say that. So for years, Wolf did exactly what he was trained to do. He compartmentalized. He moved on with his career, eventually leaving the Air Force and entering the private sector. Now, what made it even more difficult for Wolf was the complete lack of any public confirmation. The photos he saw were never released. NASA never made any announcement about artificial structures on the moon. No mainstream scientist or astronaut ever acknowledged anything remotely close to what he had witnessed. And as far as the public was concerned, the moon was gray and lifeless. But Wolf, of course, knew differently. And here's where things get especially disturbing. Over time, he started to realize that he wasn't the only person who had seen things like this. Scattered through obscure documents, whistleblower interviews, and declassified files, Wolf began finding echoes of his experience, accounts from other individuals in military and intelligence roles who had seen anomalous photos or heard rumors of structures and unknown objects in lunar imagery. Still, he still didn't go out to the public. For over 35 years, Carl Wolf held on to this secret. And it wasn't just fear that kept him silent, it was the feeling of powerlessness. He knew that even if he did come forward, who would believe him? He had no photos, he had no recordings, he had no proof, he literally only had his memory. But that all changed in the early 2000s when he crossed paths with a growing movement that aimed to break the silence surrounding UFOs and extraterrestrial encounters. That movement was known as the Disclosure Project. Founded by Dr. Stephen Greer, a physician turned UFO researcher, the Disclosure Project wasn't your average conspiracy group. Greer had a very ambitious vision. He wanted to gather credible military, intelligence, and government insiders, people with first-hand experience or classified knowledge, and give them a global platform to testify what they knew regarding UFOs, extraterrestrial life, and government secrecy. The idea was simple, but I mean, it was kind of revolutionary. It was, to present the public and the press with real witnesses, with real credentials, and let them speak under oath. And the goal was to force government transparency and full public disclosure of extraterrestrial contact. Now, in May of 2001, that goal reached a new level when Greer organized a press conference at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Over 20 military and government insiders came forward publicly, offering sworn testimonies about what they had seen or heard during their careers. And among them was Carl Wolf. This was the moment that, he had been waiting for his entire life. He had the opportunity to finally tell his story without fear, without ridicule, and with others by his side who had experienced similar things. When he took the stage, he wasn't dramatic or flashy. He was calm, measured, and clear. He told the story of how he had been called to repair equipment related to lunar photography, how he had seen classified images, real photos of alien structures on the moon's dark side, how another technician had, quietly told him, "We've discovered a base on the backside of the moon." Wolf explained that the structures he saw in those images were clearly artificial, with angles, shapes, and layouts that simply just don't occur in, nature. They looked like towers, domes, machinery, and even what resembled radar installations. He described being shocked and deeply disturbed, not just by what he saw, but by the implications and the complete lack of transparency surrounding it. The press conference was streamed and broadcasted widely. Clips of Wolf's testimony spread across UFO forums, documentaries, and news outlets around the world. Many who watched were impressed by his composure and credibility. He wasn't trying to sell anything, and he wasn't trying to write a book. He literally had nothing to gain. In fact, all he had to offer was a deeply personal account that he believed the world had the right to hear. And while some skeptics dismissed him due to the lack of physical evidence, again, the no photos, the no documents, others saw him as a part of a much larger puzzle. A pattern of testimony that, when assembled, painted a picture of deliberate and coordinated secrecy at the highest levels of government and aerospace operations. His bravery helped set a precedent. It told other whistleblowers that they weren't alone, and that, there were platforms out there willing to listen. He wasn't a showman. He was a technician, a military insider, and, at that point, he was a civilian with nothing to prove. He was simply trying to just do what he believed was right. And yet, even after his public testimony, there was no official response from NASA, the Department of Defense, or any government agency. No investigation, just literal silence. And to, Carl Wolf, that silence said everything. He remained vocal in the UFO community in the years followed, and he occasionally gave interviews, he would attend conferences, and he just spoke about his experience. But he never strayed from his original account. He never exaggerated, he never embellished. His story remained consistent right up until, the very end of his life. Now, these have been 4 of the scariest or the craziest alien stories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, along with the backstories, extra details, and hopefully, you guys with all of this information can decide if these stories were real or not. Alrighty, y'all. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys did enjoy, please be sure to subscribe with those post notifications on, as it truly does help me out a lot. And without further ado, I hope you guys have a fantastic rest of your day or night, or if you're sleeping right now, I hope you're sleeping well. Also, do you guys sleep to these videos? I see some comments where people would be like, "Oh, perfect, just in time for bedtime," or stuff like that. So are you guys actually watching these videos while you sleep? If that's so, that's pretty cool that you're falling asleep to me. I appreciate it. Alrighty, guys, but I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.